You're tired, not physically tired. Your body can still rise, move, do the ordinary things. But there is a deeper weariness, as if you have rehearsed the same sorrow and the same joys so many times that the scenes have lost their novelty. You watch arguments replay like old films, watch ambitions chase themselves around a racetrack, and feel a kind of gentle, odd relief when the curtain drops. If that image lands with you, consider the possibility laid out by Edgar Cayce, that some souls return one last time, not to learn what they do not yet know, but to finish what has been begun, to synthesize, to demonstrate, and to release. The phrase for that return is final incarnation, and the road up to it is marked by signs that are less dramatic and more subtle than you might expect. This is not a litmus test with a pass or fail. According to Cayce's readings, phrased here as an interpretive guide, some people move through life carrying a sense that their curriculum is ending. They are not necessarily enlightened in an absolute sense. Rather, they have gathered enough experience to be entrusted with completion. Think of a student who has learned every lesson of a long course and now stands before the senior year. The work changes. The focus shifts from accumulation to synthesis. The last semester asks for projects that integrate everything one has studied. If this description is speaking to you, stay with me. I'll outline 7 signs often associated with what Cayce described as an old soul approaching their final earthly term, how they show up in behavior, in relationships, and in inner life. These are not proofs, they are patterns. If you find more than one of them reflecting your inner landscape, consider them invitations to look more closely at the work you might be called to finish. Sign 1. Profound exhaustion with human drama. What this feels like: relief at the end of a fight, boredom at gossip, a quiet recoil from the ceaseless churn of social performance. The soul is not lazy, it is weary of replay. There is a tiredness that comes not from exertion, but from familiarity, with patterns of hurt, with cycles of apology and repeat, with the same stories told in slightly different accents. Imagine a man who spent 30 years building an empire. He wore crisp suits, navigated boardrooms, and learned to read power the way others read the weather. He rose on energy and appetite, and for decades ambition kept him awake and inventive. Then, sometime in his late 50s, the drive that had defined him began to thin. Deals that would once fill his chest with adrenaline now felt trivial. He sat in a conference room while colleagues traded barbs, and instead of leaning in, he watched as if from behind a glass, aware of the script, the exits, the cues. His exhaustion was not a physical collapse, but a spiritual boredom. "I've seen every angle of this play," he thought. "If I stay to win, what am I winning for?" Cayce's readings describe such weariness as a sign not of failure, but of proximity to completion. The soul recognizes patterns it no longer needs to renew. Practically, this exhaustion may lead to a withdrawal from certain dramas. Less social performance, fewer arguments entered into, a new appetite for quiet places. That withdrawal can look like grace or like eccentricity, depending on how those around them respond. If this sign sits with you, ask not, "Am I weak?" but, "What is worth my energy now?" Reflect. Which recurring arguments or pursuits leave you empty rather than enlivened? Where do you find yourself stepping out of the theater mid-act, thankful for the cool air of the lobby? Sign 2. Knowing without learning. Knowing. Some gifts arrive as sudden fluency. A person sits at the piano with no formal training and begins to play as if the hands remember a repertoire never taught in this life. Or someone takes up a craft and finds their body remembering techniques on the first day. Cayce and readers like him often describe this as memory carried in the finer tissues of consciousness. Skills, languages, arts that have been practiced in former lives and surface again when the conditions call for them. Picture a 4-year-old child who finds a dusty upright in a church hall. She climbs onto the bench, touches the keys, and a melody pours out. Complex, tender, and whole. People gather and name it miracle, others call it prodigy. To the child, there is simply a rightness in the movement of her fingers. The notes are not learned, they are recalled. For an old soul, such knowing without learning can be a marker of continuity across incarnations. This sign carries with it a curious humility. Those who awaken into competence often do not boast. The skill arrives without a need for applause. It is used when called and set aside when the task is complete. For the seeker who suspects a final incarnation, these abilities are not trophies but tools, evidence of past work, and a resource for present service. If you've experienced this, try a simple experiment. Set aside time for the spontaneous practice of a skill you feel drawn to. Notice whether the effort is one of labor or of remembering. Journal about the sensation. Does it feel like meeting an old friend? What does that tell you about the debts you have already paid? Sign 3. Karmic compression. Relationships that move fast and resolve. Certain relationships arrive as if fast-forwarded. They carry a density, a history condensed into weeks or months rather than decades. A chance encounter becomes a swift mirror. Lessons that elsewhere would have required lifetime exchanges are resolved in the space of a single season. Cayce's material often points to karmic compression as a sign of final incarnations, souls stepping into rapid pattern closure, finishing what lingered. Consider a woman who met someone during a short business trip. Their connection was immediate and fierce, a romance that, in other circumstances, might have taken 10 years to unfold, condensed into 3 months. They faced old grievances without games, named betrayals with a tenderness that stunned them both, and forgave in ways that felt like an end rather than a new beginning. When the relationship concluded, it did so cleanly. There were no loose ends, no unresolved tangles. To outside eyes, it might have looked impulsive or reckless. To those two, it felt like a final exam, a closing of accounts. This compression is not always romantic. It can show up in friendships, in brief mentorships, in working relationships that demand immediate integrity. The theme is the same: density over duration, resolution over repetition. Mini exercise. Journal for 10 minutes about a relationship that felt already known. Describe the first meeting. What caught your attention? What felt familiar? Then ask, what, if anything, did that relationship close for you? Write without censoring. Let the memory show its shape. Afterward, sit with any emotions that surface. If they are heavy or clinical in nature, deep, lasting depression, suicidal thoughts, or severe anxiety, consider seeking professional support while continuing the spiritual reflection. Spiritual signs and mental health needs can coexist. One does not negate the other. Sign 4. Teaching by presence. There are people who need not speak loudly to instruct. They embody an ease that calms, a particular steadiness that allows others to rearrange themselves. Edgar Cayce's readings often describe this kind of service, souls whose mere being catalyzes learning in others. The librarian who whispers wisdom by the way she organizes books. The neighbor whose quiet hospitality shifts a community's mood. The friend whose listening becomes the lesson. Imagine a woman who worked behind the desk of a small public library. She shelved with care, guided teenagers toward books that fit like a key, and greeted regulars by name. She never asked for leadership, yet when local groups sought counsel for a town event, they turned to her for the simple reason that things in her presence grew orderly and hopeful. People left her desk feeling less fragmented, more able to take the next step. She taught without sermonizing. Her lessons arrived as invitations: how to hold a book, how to keep a promise, how to try again. Teaching by presence requires boundaries. Those who carry it must learn to give without depletion and to hold space without absorbing every sorrow. For an old soul, this form of influence is often the most natural way to serve. Rather than beginning a sequence of classes or writing manifestos, they become living templates, demonstrations of a different, quieter mastery. Practical implication: presence is learned work. Simple habits, arriving on time, keeping commitments, listening until another finishes, become vehicles of transformation. If you recognize this tendency, consider where your daily routines might be sanctified. Who notices your steadiness? Who benefits from the way you move through ordinary hours? Cumulative reflection and a necessary caution. As these signs stack, they can create a sense of being apart. That separation has its gifts, but it also carries risks. An old soul nearing a final incarnation may feel isolated, misunderstood, or tempted to withdraw completely. There is a real danger in romanticizing detachment to the point of abandonment. of relationships, of responsibilities, of health. Cayce's material does not advocate abdication. The ending of patterns is meant to free attention for service, not to sever obligations that sustain others. It is important here to be explicit. Chronic fatigue, persistent hopelessness, suicidal ideation, dramatic shifts in sleep or appetite, or the inability to function day-to-day can be signs of clinical depression or other medical conditions. If you or someone you love is experiencing these symptoms, seek appropriate care. Spiritual language and psychotherapeutic or medical intervention can, and often do, work together. The label, old soul exhaustion, should not be used to dismiss suffering that requires professional support. Sign 5. Reversed ambition, wanting less, offering more. This sign often arrives like a soft decluttering. The person who once measured success by accumulation begins to score life by subtraction. Where there was once a drive to climb, there is now an urge to simplify. The projects that remain are chosen for depth, not scale. Time with close people is privileged over public applause. According to Cayce, this inversion is a hallmark of souls who are closing a curriculum. The work shifts from get more to give away. Picture an industrialist, someone whose hands have known the weight of factories and the jargon of supply chains. He rose through systems by mastering leverage and scale. Then, after a health scare that did not kill but clarified, he began to notice the lives intersecting with his in new ways. A factory line worker he had walked past for years offered a homemade pie at a company picnic, and the gesture cracked something open. He started asking what his wealth could become if reoriented toward repair rather than expansion. His checkbooks changed. He started a small apprenticeship program in the town, teaching those who wanted to learn trades but not the trappings of profit-first management. He gave away equipment he no longer needed. His ambition didn't evaporate, it reversed. He wanted less for himself and more for a particular community. Reversed ambition does not mean irresponsibility. The industrialist did not abandon his obligations, he redirected them. He learned to balance stewardship with surrender. For many old souls, this sign is not a renunciation, but a recalibration, a movement from ego-driven accumulation toward purposeful distribution. We can pause here to ask, what would you give away if you believed less in your personal accumulation and more in communal completion? Write a short list of 3 things, skills, time, resources, that you could begin to redistribute in small, practical ways this month. Consider starting with one modest, sustainable action. A consistent hour a week mentoring someone, donating a tool that no longer gets used, or offering a free consultation to someone starting in your field. At this point, the story of the industrialist hangs on a decision. He faces resistance from associates who idolize growth. He feels the tug of familiar measures, and yet his waking moments are filled with images of apprentices learning at his old benches, laughter between them like a promise of repair. The scene is not resolved. It is a hinge, a choice that will later ripple into other lives. Sign 6 and the ache for home wait beyond this hinge, along with the sense of culminative completion that crowns the pattern. But before we cross into those final territories, let us stay with what has already emerged. The fatigue, the remembered skill, the compressed relationship, the quiet teaching, and now the careful shedding of ambition. Together they form a contour of a life that has been deeply lived and is now, gently but insistently, being asked to finish. In the days that follow such recognition, many find themselves wanting practical steps. How to steward the last work without turning away from the world. How to speak truth without alienating those who might misunderstand. How to prepare for departure without fleeing obligation. Those questions will come into clearer focus as the signs continue to unfold, and as Cayce's voice suggests, the purposes of a final incarnation, completion, service, demonstration, become clearer when walked through with intention rather than simply noticed as traits. For now, rest in the possibility that your weariness is not a failure but an invitation. Consider who will benefit from what you choose to finish and whom your calm presence might teach. Think of your life as a manuscript in its final draft. Some paragraphs will require rewriting. Some chapters must be carefully closed, and certain sentences will need to be read aloud so others may learn how they were written. There is work in that final editing, and it is sacred work. The choice the industrialist faces maps onto a question many of you may be sitting with. When the pattern urges you to release, how do you do so responsibly? How do you refuse the hollow applause and accept a quieter recompense? The answer will come not as a formula, but as a practice, a series of small acts that both honor your obligations and reveal the kind of service that feels like the right finish to a long course. The choice the industrialist faces maps onto a question many of you may be sitting with. When the pattern urges you to release, how do you do so responsibly? How do you refuse the hollow applause and accept a quieter recompense? The answer will come not as a formula, but as a practice, a series of small acts that both honor your obligations and reveal the kind of service that feels like the right finish to a long course. If this is speaking to you, consider subscribing for more reflections like this, spaces where we sit with these questions together and learn how to finish well. Sign 6. Homesickness for nowhere. What this feels like. A longing that is not for a country, a childhood, or even a person, but for a frequency, a texture of being that feels like a deeper residence. People who recognize this sign often describe it as an ache beneath ordinary sorrow, a pull toward horizons that language flattens into the word home. According to Cayce's readings, some souls carry memories of other systems, different densities or mythic origins, images of bright councils, of water cities, of star fields that look more like family rooms than foreign skies. Whether one takes these cosmological attributions literally or poetically, the subjective experience is the same, a gravitational tug toward an attunement beyond daily life. Imagine a woman who, since adolescence, has felt a peculiar nostalgia when she looks at certain constellations. At strange hours she sits by her window and watches the slow rotation of lights over the winter plain, and feels a recognition that has nothing to do with astronomy class. It is not homesickness for a house, but for a state, a sense of belonging to a frequency that hums under mundane sound. In social rooms, she sometimes misunderstands jokes. She senses crowds as noise and solitary landscapes as conversations. Music that opens certain harmonic intervals calms her more than company. She does not always tell this to friends. How could she? And so the feeling becomes private, an inner ache that she learns to carry like an old photograph that fades when shown to others. Cayce described images like these not as pathology but as memory, echoes of prior orientation. For those inclined to his framework, names like Arcturus, Pleiades, and Sirius appear as poetic labels for different tonal homes. For others, the language of home might be metaphorical, an existential longing for deep rest, union, or meaning. Either way, the effect is the same, a soulful awareness that the current life is not the whole of the story. Expanded Cayce, the woman at the observatory. She worked part-time at a small planetarium to earn extra income during university. The job was practical, ticket sales, sweeping, running the projector. But the late-night sessions became something else. After the last group left and the rotunda emptied, she would sit under the domed ceiling and watch the stars roll overhead in slow, engineered grace. Once, while tracing the line of a constellation with a child's flashlight, she realized she knew the myth that accompanied it not because she'd read it, but because the syllables fit the shape the way a glove fits a hand. On her bike rides home, she would hum a tune that seemed to stitch her breath into the night, and sometimes strangers would pause and ask if she knew the name of the song. She did not. The tune felt like a language that her chest had forgotten how to speak out loud. When she dated, the relationships were often tender and kind, but never quite anchoring. Something behind the scenes whispered of a different allegiance. She could feel the life inside her striking match to other lives she'd already lived, and this memory made ordinary attachments seem thin. She carried the ache gently. It made her more compassionate in some moments, less quick to insist on small harms and more inclined to forgive, but it also made particulars feel a bit foreign. She learned small rituals to soothe herself, lighting a particular lavender at dusk, listening to tones that seemed to resonate along her ribs, walking to a hilltop to watch the slow immigration of night. These practices were not remedies that erased the longing. They were ways to acknowledge it and to welcome whatever ambiguity followed. Mini lesson on homesickness and practical exercises. Cayce framed homesickness as both a sign and a resource. It marks a soul who remembers other rhythms, and that remembrance can become a teacher. It also can be destabilizing if treated as an indictment of earthly life. The practical work is not to numb the ache nor to deny it, but to translate it into practices that keep you grounded while honoring what longs to be remembered. Exercise A. Stargazing reflection. On a clear night, find a quiet place where the sky is visible. Sit with a small notebook. For 5 minutes, simply look up without naming constellations or making judgments. Let the light land on you. Then write 3 images or feelings that arise. Do not analyze, just collect. Afterward, ask, which of these images feel like invitations to tend? Which feel like echoes that might inform how you shape ordinary days? Exercise B. Sound as bridge. Choose a piece of music, instrumental with long sustained tones, that moves you. Listen for 12 minutes with eyes closed. Pay attention to where in the body the music vibrates. Afterward, note a small action. Lighting a candle, calling a friend, walking a particular route, or integrating a 5-minute listening practice each week. Use sound not to escape the world, but to temper it, to translate longing into rhythm. Sign 7. Absolute knowing of completion. This is the climactic sign. It is less a sensation than a settled stance, a quiet, often unannounced certainty that this life has a particular end in view. People with this sign are not necessarily grandiose. The knowing is intimate and often companioned by tenderness. It arrives like the lowering of a lid into its groove. No clang, no fanfare, just a click that means something is properly set. Picture a retired schoolteacher who, after decades of shaping young minds, wakes one morning with the conviction that she has no more lessons to accumulate. She does not feel finished with kindness, nor with the work of being human. Rather, she recognizes that her role has shifted. Where once she prepared students to enter a broader world, she now understands her primary task to be to demonstrate how one closes with grace. Her days become quieter, her conversations less explanatory and more exemplifying. When she helps a neighbor carry groceries, she does so with a calm that models steadiness rather than instructing resilience. Cayce's readings often describe this absolute knowing as a sign of readiness to graduate, a point at which the soul's arc bends toward completion. In his language there is an internal registry. Memories have been integrated sufficiently, lessons no longer require rehearsal, and the soul's attention is free to be given over to service or to return, according to its directives. Some report this knowing as luminous and gentle, others as austere and plain. In either case, the sense is the same, a conviction that the present life contains a last page, and that the work now is to write it with intentionality. Expanded Cayce, the elder gardener. He had spent his life tending a municipal garden plot. He knew the soil in the way one knows an old friend, its moods, its secret promises. In his mid-60s, he began to prune with an economy that made neighbors notice. He no longer chased every bloom. He shaped the beds so that apprentices could learn a few reliable, honest things about plant life. His talks at the community center shifted from how-to how we have been, stories that collected the wisdom of seasons. One afternoon he found himself saying to a young volunteer, "It is enough to show them how to love the soil." And in this sentence was the entire curriculum he had been carrying. He did not boast about feeling finished, he simply adjusted his days. If visitors asked whether he was retiring, he would shrug and say the work was changing. He began keeping a small journal of final instructions, practical, banal, and luminous. Where the tap leak usually begins after frost, the best soil mix for late summer tomatoes, how to tie a young stem without breaking its tender vein. He left these notes in a drawer of his shed, not as a monument but as a handing over. The posture of absolute knowing is not indifference, it is stewardship. What it refuses is frantic accumulation of proof. What it accepts is the quiet task of closing chapters so that others can open theirs. A short guided reflection for sign 7. Take 5 minutes now to picture how you would like to finish one small project this month. Be specific. Name the project, name the steps, Name one person it will benefit. Keep the steps realistic and bound them in time. The practice of finishing small things builds competency for finishing large ones. Mini lesson on karmic compression, after sign 3, brief expansion. Karmic compression, the experience of dense, rapid closure, deserves a short, focused reflection. When patterns condense, they are asking for concentrated attention. Cayce's readers often observe that such compression is not random. It brings together elements that, when resolved, release long-held tensions. Think of it as a pressure cooker. The heat is intense, but the result is expedited integration. Practical exercise for karmic compression. When a relationship feels unusually dense, try this 2-step practice. First, observe without immediate reaction. Note 3 concrete facts about the relationship's dynamics: dates, gestures, recurring topics. Second, ask a single clarifying question aloud or in writing. What, if resolved, would make this relationship simpler and kinder? Keep the answer practical and oriented toward closure: apology, boundary, acknowledgement, or blessing. If the material is volatile or traumatic, seek support rather than attempting to resolve it alone. What happens after graduation? Cayce's material offers a spectrum of possibilities for what follows a final incarnation, always framed as options rather than absolute certainties. He suggested that some souls return to serve as guides, intelligences that accompany those who remain, while others enter different systems of experience, merge temporarily with creative source, or choose voluntary returns to assist particular groups. These options are not presented as a linear hierarchy. Rather, they are portrayed as roles adapted to the soul's capacities and commitments. According to the readings, some souls choose to continue active service in less localized ways. Mentoring by presence, participating in councils beyond earthly comprehension, or teaching through arts, music, or symbolic forms that translate across densities. Others may wish to rest in a kind of communal reflection, where life's tapestry is reviewed and the threads are rewoven for future expression. Still others elect to return in disguise, reincarnating again out of voluntary love to help steer younger souls through pivotal epochs. It is important to treat these possibilities gently. For some, the imagery of star systems and other realms will resonate literally. For others, such language will be poetic shorthand for experiences beyond verbal capture. Both responses are valid within the exploratory frame we are using. Cayce described a cosmology. You may or may not accept it as metaphysical fact. The practical value is the same. These narratives offer models for imagining what completion looks like: continued service, rest, or voluntary return. Purposes of a final incarnation: completion, service, demonstration. Cayce suggested 3 primary aims for a final incarnation. They read like old academic headings: completion, service, demonstration, but each holds a moral weight that reorients ordinary choices. Completion. This purpose is the obvious one. It asks that whatever remains be finished, unpaid debts reconciled, unspoken truths spoken, personal projects brought to a mindful close. Completion does not mean perfection. It means integration enough that loose ends do not bind or repeat in subsequent cycles. Practically, completion asks you to inventory what still tugs at your attention and to prioritize what must end before you can go on. Service. Final incarnations often tilt toward service. That service may be quiet, a presence that steadies a community, or it may be active, healing work, teaching, setting up institutions that outlast the body. The ethic here is not grandiosity, but fidelity. What service aligns with your capacities and with the integrity you have built? Demonstration. Some souls are called to be exemplars. Your life becomes a visible proof for others, that one can reconcile, forgive, and leave well. Demonstration is not exhibition. It is living as an argument without words. The old gardener, the retired teacher, the librarian, each demonstrates alternative modes of being that younger souls may imitate and thereby shorten their own learning curves. Challenges of final incarnation: isolation, temptation to withdraw, weight of choices. Proximity to completion brings challenges. Isolation is a real risk. Others may not understand your diminished appetite for drama, and you may be tempted to withdraw in a way that neglects duties. There can also be an inner temptation to believe you are above ordinary accountability. Choose instead the other difficult discipline, to stay present while letting go of what no longer serves your end. Responsibility grows as the arc shortens. Your actions have a different bearing. The industrialist's decision to gift his equipment, the gardener's journal of instructions, these are moral decisions that affect more than the self. The weight can be heavy because your margin for error may feel smaller. Still, responsibility should not immobilize you. Use it to make clearer, kinder choices. Another challenge is misunderstanding. Friends may label your restraint as aloofness. Colleagues may call your redirection a midlife crisis. These misreadings sting. Respond with patience, not defensiveness. Demonstrate through steadiness more than argument. Practical guidance for living a final incarnation. Complete the unfinished with clarity and dignity. Begin with a short inventory. List 3 projects, relationships, or responsibilities you sense are incomplete. For each, write one next step you can commit to completing within 30 days. Keep steps modest and measurable. 1 phone call, 1 apology, 1 donation, 1 letter. Completion often moves through small, repeated acts rather than grand finales. Release what you cannot change. Make a practice of choosing one recurring worry each week and delegating it either to a trusted friend or to the not now shelf. Ritual of release. Write the worry on a scrap of paper, fold it, and place it in a small box. At the end of a month, review what remains and decide whether to act, delegate, or let it go. The ritual is symbolic, but it trains the nervous system to distinguish between the soul's work and the ego's compulsions. Simplify life deliberately. Reversed ambition calls for economy of attention. Reduce commitments that do not align with completion and increase those that serve it. Simplification is tactical. It is not resignation. It is choosing fewer joyfully tended things over many half-attended ones. Share wisdom generously and simply. Teaching by presence can be formalized into gentle acts. Mentoring one person consistently, writing a short note for an apprentice, or offering a monthly community hour for questions. Keep communication concrete. The gift of lived example is not in poetry, but in how you treat bills, in how you answer the phone when someone calls with a small crisis, in how you apologize. Conscious preparation for transition. Cayce urged that preparation be practical and spiritual. Practically, make sure affairs are in order. Legal documents, explanations for those you love, mentorship for roles you hold. Spiritually, cultivate practices that steady you. A daily short meditation, a ritual of gratitude, the regular habit of forgiving and asking forgiveness. These practices do not guarantee a painless departure. They do create an environment of integrity and care. A suggested sequence of practical steps for the coming year. Month 1, inventory and triage. Identify 3 things that ask for completion. For each, set one concrete next step to be done this month. Month 3, simplify schedule. Remove 2 commitments that deplete you without serving others. Replace them with one sustainable service, a weekly 30-minute mentoring call, a monthly community garden morning, or a consistent phone check-in. Month 6, teacher handover. Prepare a small packet, notes, recorded instructions, or a short in-person session. Passing practical knowledge to successors. Month 9, ritualize gratitude and release. Plan a quiet ceremony with trusted people or alone. Speak aloud what you are grateful for, what you release, what you hope for those who remain. Throughout, keep the balance between finishing and presence. Do not weaponize completion as an excuse to avoid the messy work of love. Case example, tying purpose to practice. The apprentice program. The industrialist eventually chose to pilot an apprenticeship program at one of his old plants. He began small, 2 apprentices, a retired foreman as mentor, afternoon classes on ethics and repair. Rather than design a corporate flagship, he focused on the townspeople's needs and on sustaining the craft. He documented processes not for profit reports, but for apprentices' notebooks. The program's success was not measured in market share, but in the quiet dignity of employable hands and steady hours. When asked why he had given away equipment he had once guarded, he would say, "Because the machines will make more than money, they make room." Post-incarnation possibilities revisited. Practical imaginations. If you resonate with Cayce's language, you might imagine that after the final life one moves into a different mode of service, becoming a guide, participating in a council, or resting in an integrative community. If that imagery does not fit you, reimagine it as a psychological model. Completion leads to different kinds of influence, less egoic and more archetypal. Either way, the practical implication is similar. How you finish now shapes how you are available later. The generosity you practice in small acts multiplies into the patterns by which you will be remembered, and by which younger seekers will orient themselves. A note about language and humility. We invoke these possibilities with humility. Cayce spoke as an interpreter of experiences that resist easy mapping. Whether you take his cosmology literally or allegorically, let the core invitation land. That there are lives where learning gives way to finishing, where service becomes subtle, and where the soul's posture shifts from acquiring to offering. Keep curiosity alive and avoid the trap of certainty. The spiritual life, especially at this edge, benefits from both conviction and open questioning. Difficult situations and ethical cautions. Completing well sometimes requires hard moral labor, saying no to a partner's harmful pattern, reporting abuse, ending a job that contributes to harm. Completion is not a license for selfishness. If you sense that a relationship or situation is abusive or dangerous, prioritize safety for you and others. The rhetoric of final incarnation must never be used to justify harm or neglect. Seek counsel, legal advice, or support networks as appropriate. Also, avoid conflating spiritual fatigue with clinical illness. If the tiredness you feel is accompanied by suicidal ideation, profound cognitive changes, or inability to care for yourself, please seek professional help. Spiritual narratives can accompany and enrich clinical care, but they should not replace it. A few more illustrative vignettes, serving as mirrors. The healing child. In one set of Cayce-style narratives, a child who displayed unusual sensitivity would at times place hands on scraped knees and calm the child without adult teaching. The local community called the child gifted. The family learned to balance ordinary care with gentle boundaries so the child's sensitivity would not be overwhelmed. The story shows how early returns of skill can be integrated with careful education and love. The brief mentor. A retired midwife who spent decades assisting births, found late life calling to train a handful of young doulas. Her work was not flashy. She met them weekly, shared stories, and taught the quiet, practical craft of waiting with another human. Her influence multiplied, not through celebrity but through hands she had touched directly. The rapid relationship resolved. A young teacher met a partner during a sabbatical. Their brief, intense union forced both to confront ancestries of abandonment. They worked with honesty and care and ended together with mutual blessing. No recrimination, just clarity. Both said later that the relationship felt like a clearing, not a loss. Each vignette underscores a practical ethic. Contain intensity with context, give gifts with boundaries, finish with kindness. Preparing those you love. Final incarnations can be easier for those around you if you prepare them gently. Talk about values more than metaphysics. Speak about what you want done if you are less able to act. Create simple documents that explain practical matters, contacts, passwords, where to find important papers. Teach one person a particular task. How to tend a garden bed, where to pay a bill, how to start the coffee for your morning ritual. These acts are gifts. They ease the transition and honor your responsibility to others. A short exercise in generosity, the 1-hour donation. Choose 1 hour in the next 2 weeks to do something for someone without expectation of reciprocity. It might be practical, raking leaves for a neighbor, fixing a light switch for a friend, or intangible, listening without advice, sharing a recipe. Keep it small and repeatable. The practice trades accumulation for circulation and teaches the limbic system to take joy in giving away. Final cautions and reframing of success. If you are on this path, resist equating final incarnation with perfection. This is not a story of flawless beings removing themselves from mess. It is about beings who have learned enough to be asked into a different station of responsibility. Where you fall, apologize. Where you harm unknowingly, repair. Where you can be steady, be steady. The measure is not seamlessness, but fidelity. Closing reflections and benediction-like send-off. If more than one of the 7 signs has landed in your interior landscape, take it as an invitation rather than a diagnosis. Consider the practical steps offered here as experiments, small, reversible commitments to live with more clarity, more service, and more completion. Finish the things that ask to be finished. Simplify where simplification serves others. Share what you know without seeking to convert. Prepare the practical affairs of your earthly life with the same tenderness you might use to fold a beloved shirt in a drawer. There will be moments of doubt. There will be days when the old habits swell and call you back into drama. Return to the practice of naming one small, kind action and doing it. Over time, the accumulation of such acts becomes the architecture of a life closed with care. If this message has resonated, leave a comment below. Type, "I am ready," if you feel sure this resonates, or "remembering," if these ideas are new but stirring something inside. Your words help build a quiet community where these topics can be held without haste. Go gently. The work of finishing is intimate and public both. It asks courage and practical love. Whatever your belief about the afterlife, you can steward this life so that it teaches others how to live, and, in so doing, becomes the clearest proof you could offer. A life brought home. Thank you for listening.